Hello and welcome to the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel, and on today's episode, I'm speaking with Grace Liu. Grace is an autistic author, blogger, speaker, and pet portrait artist based in the Midlands of England. Grace's book, Approaching Autistic Adulthood, The Road Less Traveled, was published in October 2021. It focuses on getting to grips with independent adult life as an autistic person and covers areas such as education, work, and understanding your identity as an autistic person. Grace has delivered multiple talks about autism and diversity, most recently at the Birmingham National Exhibition Center, or NEC, for the annual Health and Wellbeing at Work conference, and online for Neurodiversity Celebration Week. She's a keen advocate for issues surrounding autism, neurodiversity, diversity, and inclusion, and regularly addresses these issues on her blog. Grace is also a pet portrait artist and has received many commissions for her drawings, especially over the past year. She's a dedicated owner to 4 cats, having had an autistic interest in cats from a very young age. Grace, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yes, it's lovely to be here. Lovely to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you too. So I'd love to learn more about your personal story. Like, when did your family realize that you're autistic?
I'm going to have to go back a bit and explain about being born in Taiwan first, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, I was born in Taiwan. My mum is English, but she was living and working in Taiwan at the time, and that's where she met my dad. And then we ended up moving back to the UK when she and my dad split up. I just turned 4 at the time, and my sister hadn't yet been born. My mum was 6 months pregnant, so that was a challenge. And we moved to a village called Cam, which is sort of in the West Country of England, quite far from here. And I started at primary school, the equivalent of elementary school in the US. And I suppose I was already different in that I was half Chinese and had just moved to another country. So I think the fact that I was a bit socially awkward and withdrawn was kind of put down to that initially. Yeah, my mum has a lot of funny anecdotes actually about what a weird child I was at that age. Like, for example, when we were still in Taiwan, and at kindergarten, we were asked to have a go at making clay pots. And at the end of the day, my kindergarten teacher said to my mum, "Oh, Mrs. Liu, Grace is no good at making clay pots." So my mum asked me later, "What did you make at kindergarten today, Grace?" And I replied, "Penguin feet," as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. But yeah, and then in the UK, there was one lesson where we were learning all about African cultures, and we all had a go at making our own African bag. And for some reason, I drew a snowman on mine. Don't ask me why. Yeah, I was a strange child. I didn't like the same things that other kids liked. My head teacher blamed it on my mum being a bad single parent because she was a single parent on benefits, and they get all the hate, don't they? They even had me checked by a school nurse for bruises in case I was being abused, which was really upsetting for my mum. And I was asked to basically strip down so they could check me, to which I responded, "But it's rude to show people your knickers." Knickers being underpants. So, yeah, I was different, but the school were steadfastly ignoring it. I think possibly racism maybe came into play because it was a very white, very rural, middle-class English village without very much diversity. So then my mum married my stepdad, and we moved in with him. I was 8 at the time, and within weeks, I was getting noticed for my autism-related struggles. We had one member of staff looking at a child who was already diagnosed, and she immediately noticed me. And to cut a very long story short, that's how I was diagnosed.
Oh, so yeah, that's so interesting that big change in your life with your stepdad moving in,
Yeah.
that was sort of coincided with the realization that you might be autistic and actually are autistic.
Yeah, well, my mum was looking into it for a while. My first primary school didn't want anything to do with it. They looked down on her, and I think they didn't quite take me seriously because I wasn't fully English. But the new primary school I moved to in a completely different town was, well, it was completely different. They were much more on it, much more willing to collaborate.
So was it a surprise to your parents or your family that you wound up getting an autism diagnosis?
I don't think so at this stage. I think it was something that was kind of on the cards before. To be honest, I wasn't very aware of it. I was just a small child. And then there's the story of when they actually told me of my diagnosis, and I can't remember exactly what happened, but they basically said something like, okay, so you're on the autistic spectrum, which means you're made a little bit differently to other kids. My first question, for some reason, was, oh, can I have a piece of cheese? Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it changed much for me socially, but it did mean that I was entitled to a support worker in lessons, so I wasn't falling behind academically nearly as much. So that made a big difference to me.
Yeah. So what was life like for you after you got your diagnosis? Like, did things change significantly at school or with friends?
Well, as I said, I got support in lessons. Socially, not really. I was aware that I was different, but it's not. I didn't really have much self-awareness. I didn't really understand the implications of it. I just knew that I was happy in my own little world, pursuing whatever weird interests I had in the time. I did have friendships, but I mostly preferred to play on my own. I very quickly kind of lost focus in groups. It got harder when I got to secondary school or high school or whatever you want to call it, because it was a much bigger school. Kids were much meaner and trying to get to the top of the social hierarchy, so that made things a lot more challenging. Yeah, that was really difficult. I think one struggle I had particularly was forming and maintaining friendships, because I'd learned the social rules. I'd learned how to kind of mask, if you like, and kind of act like other kids, but then I didn't quite understand why I couldn't keep it up for very long. I didn't understand the concept of burnout or just overload. I was sort of starting these friendships and saying all the right things, and then they were just fizzling out, and I just didn't know how to deal with that. So that caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of social isolation. And I also got a lot of harassment from boys because of my race, which wasn't much fun.
Yeah. And things are so different socially in primary school versus secondary school. Not that they're easier in primary school, but in
No.
secondary school you get that extra layer of like people kind of acting in strange ways or not saying what they mean, or there's like all these like hidden social agendas that you have to learn. It's, I don't know.
Yeah, like everyone's changing and you can't quite keep up with it. And to make things even more complicated, you're changing in yourself, having to go through puberty and mood swings and kind of having to dress differently and wash differently and so on. And then deal with more complicated lessons, more complicated social rules. Yeah, I don't miss it.
Yeah, no, that was definitely a tough time of life. Absolutely. Wow. And you write about some of the experiences that you've had at work, like once you graduated and went to the working world. What was your experience working at different jobs, like being autistic and being mixed race in the UK?
Well, I'm quite lucky in that my race hasn't been too much of an issue at work, or at least not what I've noticed. Autism has definitely been an issue in workplaces. Yeah, I've had quite a few negative experiences with work, and I'll have to try and be fairly discreet about this. I've had a lot of issues, mainly with communication and managers. I can remember one job where my manager would say something like, "Oh, there's no right or wrong way of doing X, Y, Z," and then I'd do it, and I'd somehow end up doing it the wrong way, because what he actually meant was there are some right ways and some wrong ways, and you just got to figure out which one.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing. And also, if I would just ask a simple yes or no question, I'd be wanting a simple yes or no answer, and then they would just say, I don't know, they'd just go all the way back to the beginning of the instructions and load me with extra information. I'd be like, whoa, I don't want to know all that. I don't understand. You're not answering my question.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when it comes to work, people talk a lot about autism and sensory overload and navigating the social politics, and those are all quite significant struggles. But I think the main issues for me have been communication and picking up knowledge in the same way as other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes needing more time for processing. And like you were saying, just getting way too much information and then sort of being expected to process it immediately and have like some sort of appropriate reaction is, yeah, that's tough, especially in work life. Yeah.
Yeah, I've also had some jobs where I've really struggled to pick up knowledge in the same way as other people. So I can retain knowledge like a sponge if A, it's something I'm naturally very interested in, or B, it's something that I'm specifically pursuing. And because I was doing a lot of blogging, naturally I was learning about all the stuff that I was blogging about for the company,
Mm-hmm.
but then I wasn't picking up on sort of background knowledge of how other aspects of the company worked and how, different roles that weren't directly related to mine worked. And that caused a lot of tension between me and the people in charge. I was like, well, if no one's ever sat me down and told me about this stuff and talked me through it regularly, and it's not directly linked to my job role, how am I supposed to know it?
Right. Yeah, exactly. You're just expected to pick things up somehow, and it doesn't always work out that
Yeah,
way.
yeah, it's frustrating.
Yeah. So, you blog about a lot of these topics and much more on the blog that you've had. And you've been blogging for a long time. It's been like
Yeah,
more than 10 years. So what
it
inspired
has.
you to, yeah, that's amazing in the online content creation world. So like what inspired you to start blogging about your life as an autistic person?
To be honest, I mostly just wanted to hone my writing skills, and I knew that blogging was a way to do it. I'd read other people's blogs, and I thought, well, I want to get into writing. I want to be a writer. This is apparently how I do it. And then one year I got a book called Blogging for Dummies for Christmas, I think from one of my stepbrothers. And so, of course, naturally I had to give it a go. I wasn't actually planning to write about autism right away. I mostly just wanted to try writing about anything of interest because one of my one of my sisters-in-law at the time had a blog and she just wrote about things that were interesting to her or things that happened to her. So that was the approach I took at first. But then I began to realize, actually, I've got a lot I want to say about autism and my experiences, and this is a really good platform for it. So I think it was probably about maybe a couple of years into blogging that I started kind of making it an autism blog. I mean, autism isn't the only thing I write about. I do still write about other areas of interest or key things that happened to me, but it just sort of became an autism blog, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you pick what topics to write about on there?
It's just whatever's on my heart. I do try and keep a list of blog topics I want to write about so I don't forget them. I'll write it down either in my journal or on my computer, whichever I've got to hand. And there have been quite a few times in my life where I've planned ahead which blog I'm going to write about on which date. I haven't been as on top of it lately, but that's something I'm working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you've written about so many different aspects of your life on there, and one of them is that you've written about your experience as a biracial person living in the UK. And I know you talked a little bit about growing up, some of the racism and other sort of biases that you faced as a child growing up there. What kinds of challenges or stereotypes have you faced that you've either written about or just experienced?
Um, well, at school, I had a lot of boys who would be catcalling me, but doing it in a racist way at the same time. So hitting on me in the same way that teenage boys tend to do to girls, but also saying things like, I want to have your Chinese babies, or calling me a racial slur to get a laugh out of their mates, out of their friends. And one boy who was actively hostile to me and didn't want me anywhere near him because of my race. Since then, I haven't experienced too many race-related issues, but I have had over the years a lot of experiences where people have come up to me and said "ni hao" to me because they see me and they assume I can't speak English, or sometimes people will just shout it for a laugh in public, or they'll shout things like "Great Wall of China" or "Konnichiwa" at me. So yeah, just dealing with other people's stupidity and well-meaning assumptions. I had one person in the streets once walk up to me and offer me Chinese literature for some reason.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I often feel like with race, I sort of feel partly marginalized but partly privileged as well, because although I'm not white, I'm light skinned, so I don't have to go through all the grief that people who are black or fully Asian often seem to go through. But now I don't really fully identify with fully white people because they've never had to deal with any assumptions or stereotypes or hostility. So it sort of feels like I'm treading in two worlds with it, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And since you moved from Taiwan at such a young age and have, spent most of your life with your mother and your stepfather who are white, is that relating yourself to culture? Like, do you relate to Chinese culture? Is it part of your identity, or how does that
Um,
interface?
yeah, a little bit. I mean, to be honest, I think my mum feels like at least as much as I do. She's fully white, fully British, but she spent quite a number of years in Taiwan, so she got very acclimatized to the culture and the cooking. So we're very into Chinese and Taiwanese cooking in my family. I've always had a strong taste for spicy food. A lot of autistic people say that they need things to be plain, they need things to taste the same. I'm very much the opposite. I'm quite sensory seeking with flavour. I don't know if it's just because of my autism or just because of my background. But yeah, we like Chinese food. We like lots of other foods as well. We don't really celebrate Chinese New Year, but we generally at least acknowledge when it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't speak Chinese. I used to when I was very little, but I do know basic words and phrases that I try and remember, and I can count in Chinese.
Mm-hmm. And you've written about that on your blog and your experiences with that part of your identity. And you've also written on your blog about your experience coming out as being gay. So I'd love to learn more about that. And like, how did you decide to come out about being gay, and what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so that's quite a tricky one. I think it was complicated by the fact that I was really struggling to accept being autistic as a teenager, because I was going through all these social struggles and all these struggles in lessons, and I hated being different. And at the same time, I was having these feelings for girls, and I was trying to deny it, trying to tell myself it was just a phase, trying to hide it, and then kind of really hating myself. And I realized, oh, blimey, I'm different in more ways than one, more ways than two, even. And I just couldn't accept the fact that I was gonna grow up struggling to make friends, struggling to retain information, and also being attracted to people who mostly couldn't be attracted to me because they're straight, and having to deal with people thinking I'm perverted or sinful or dirty. And it doesn't help that when I did start to make friends, it was with people at church. I don't want to make this sound too negative, because in many ways it was really great, because it was through that friendship group that I became more open about my autism. They were very accepting about that, and I started actually making proper friends there. But there were people who were very openly homophobic. They complain about the gay lifestyle and the gay agenda, and saying we shouldn't be accepting gay people, whilst also putting as much pressure as possible on us to be our authentic selves and be completely open and not have secrets. So that's something I've always kind of struggled with, really, when it comes to church and Christianity.
Yeah. I don't know if you can compare, but did you find it like easier or harder coming out as being gay versus like telling people that you're autistic?
I would say harder. I realise it wouldn't be that way for everyone, but I found it harder, I suppose, because I was already struggling to come out about being autistic. Then when I did, it was to people who might not have been accepting of my sexuality. I think I must have first come out to my parents. I remember I was just about to go back to uni for my third year, so this would have been kind of mid 2000s at some point, and they were absolutely fine. They were really great about it, really accepting. And I can remember I really wanted to kind of talk to someone else about it and not just keep it as a family secret. And I really wanted to tell my best friend about it. So I came out to her about a year later. It was over dinner, actually. We were meeting up as we so often did. And it was just one of our normal meetups. So I was trying to figure out, okay, I really want to talk to her about this, but I don't know how to do it. And so I kind of just blurted it out to her, and she was so lovely about it and so accepting. It was one of the things we kind of bonded over and sort of cemented our friendship. And she asked me about my experiences and kept telling me how brave I was and saying thank you for trusting her. So I'm really lucky to have her in my life. She laughed at me a little bit because we were having ice cream sundaes for dessert, and I was so nervous that I didn't even notice that I'd completely crumbled my wafer to dust into my ice cream.
Oh no. Wow. Well, yeah, that's great that your parents and your best friend have been so supportive. That's just
Yeah,
so
I
important to
only
have people like that in our
I
life.
only publicly came out in 2021 because I suppose because I was becoming such a strong advocate for autism, and I was talking about my experiences with autism and my sexuality, not my sexuality at this stage, my race and being born in Taiwan and so on. And I really just wanted to be able to talk about my sexuality as freely as I talked about everything else. But I didn't quite feel brave enough. But I was writing my book at the time, and I thought, I really want to be able to reach out to other autistic people through my book who might be experiencing this. So I wrote about it in my book, but I also wrote about it in my blog at that time, and that was when I officially publicly came out. I wrote this blog post, posted it on the internet, and it actually went much better than I thought it would, because there are lots of people who could have taken it really badly, who either took it well or just didn't respond at all. And actually that it turned out okay. And again, I realise I'm a lot luckier than a lot of LGBT people here, so that's something I try and hold on to. Yeah, that's my coming out story.
Wow. Has it been a struggle for you to accept being both autistic and gay?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was at secondary school, and actually, even in early adult life, it was hard because I was going to church. I had all these church contacts, but it was at a church that kind of had, well, I wouldn't say it was openly homophobic, but there were people there who were, and people just turned a blind eye to it, and yet there were so many talks saying how important it is to be open and be vulnerable. And I have real issues with people saying that because it's something that's so easily thrown around, but it's not something that people actually put into practice. They don't think about why it might not be a safe space for people to be completely open.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of discourse in, especially like the corporate world and the working world about like bringing your full self to work and being your authentic self at work, which I think it's a great like idealistic concept, but depending on the individual, there are serious challenges, and you really need to have an environment that's truly safe and accepting to make it feasible for anybody to be able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I have a real issue with both as a lesbian and as an autistic person, because as a lot of neurodivergent people will have experienced, I've dealt with people who will supposedly be autism friendly, but then they don't like it if, I respond to things in the way they don't expect, or I don't make full eye contact, or I'm interested in different things to them, or I struggle with different things to them. So yeah, it's like I'm allowed to exist, but I'm not allowed to be myself, even though I'm supposed to be myself.
Right. Yeah. People don't make that mental connection in their heads. Is like what it means to accept someone is, not just to say that you do, but to really put that into practice and think about what that really means for people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned your book, and I'd love to learn more about how that came about. So you published a book a couple years ago. How did you get the opportunity to write a book?
Uh, Well, the short answer is lockdown.
Mm,
I'd wanted to write a book for ages, really. It's something that I'd always said, oh, I'm going to do that one day, but it didn't really happen. And then I was thinking more and more to myself, okay, how can I make this happen? How can I make the time for it? And then COVID struck, and I was like, okay, well, that wasn't the answer to my prayers I was expecting, but hey, we'll go with it and
mm,
use that as the opportunity to write my book.
yeah. What is your book about?
So it's basically about getting to grips with independent adult life as an autistic person. I've got a copy here. Um, yeah, I'm just looking at the chapters. So I basically cover explaining autism and dealing with people's reactions and things like overload and friendships and relationships. And then I go into things like education and work and kind of explaining autism to employers and common work-related struggles and dealing with disrespectful behavior from other people.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's sort of partly just general autism information, but with an angle towards dealing with typical adult life scenarios.
Yeah. I think that's important because I hope this is changing, but I think there's still a lot of people thinking that autism is a child's condition and that somehow adults either grow out of it or autistic adults just kind of disappear after they turn 18 or 21. So there certainly need to be more books about, how to sort of approach adulthood as an autistic person and, whether you're in the working world or just trying to navigate your life as an adult. I think that's really important for people to be able to read about and understand, especially from other autistic people who have had those experiences.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of narrative on how autistic people present,
Yeah.
outward behaviors, what autism may look like, and not nearly as much focus on what autistic people actually experience. I mean, there's a lot more of it now than there was not that many years ago, but there's still a lot to be done, still a work in progress.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you're also a public speaker. You've done several engagements, recently within the last
Yeah.
couple months. Did your book help you find opportunities like public speaking or other types of opportunities to talk about your own advocacy?
Yeah, so with the NEC event recently at Birmingham, I first got contacted about that because a colleague of my stepdad had read my book and really liked it and promoted it on LinkedIn. And then I think the guy who got in touch with me about this event must have read about this from her because he emailed me and said, "Oh, I heard about your book from my friend and contact. I'd really like you to speak at this event." Yeah, that was really exciting, and it was a really big event actually. The talk itself was fairly small, but it was one of those events where basically loads of stalls, loads of things going on, and then loads of different talks that you can attend if you want to. And I got a really full room, and lots of people laughed at my talk at the right places, not in a bad way. Um, and I had loads of questions at the end, loads of people really, really interested. And yeah, it was just a really exciting thing to be a part of. I brought 6 copies of my book with me, and they all sold out.
Oh,
And it was just a really valuable networking opportunity.
right. That's
So
really
yeah,
cool. So yeah, so you've been able to do events that it sounds like, were in person, also virtual, because Neurodiversity Celebration Week, I think, is like a week long. They have a lot of virtual sessions that anyone can
yeah,
tune in.
yeah. I was on a panel for that, and we were talking about experiences with being autistic and under the LGBT umbrella. And I hadn't realised just how big an event that was. I think it had Well, I think the audience was certainly well into the hundreds, and there are people from all over the world listening, not just in the UK. There are people in the US, people all over Europe, people in all sorts of different parts of the UK. So yeah, that was quite a big one.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. Yeah. You've had a lot of opportunities to really talk about your own experience and kind of share your advocacy. You've got your book, you've got your blog, which is amazing. Like, because I appreciate, I've been podcasting since 2018, and I feel like that's a long time. So having had a blog for over 10 years, just sort of looking back is just such an amazing like richness of stories. And I'd say if anyone's thinking of creating content online and sharing it, definitely, just start, because, you'll look back in a few years and just be amazed at what you've learned and what you've grown from, and what opportunities you can get from that.
Absolutely. Well, once I really get into doing something, I will stick at it for a long time. So I think that's what happened with this blog. And there were just so many things I wanted to write about, so many things I wanted people to understand, and also so many new things that I picked up and learned that I wanted to write about, and so on. So yeah, it's kept going for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, where can people go if they want to find out about the kind of work you're doing, like your writing, your book, even your custom hand-drawn pet portraits, because I know that's a big thing that you've been doing lately as well.
So I have a website called Autistic Autistic. So the URL is artistic-autistic.co.uk, and that's got details of my book, my blog, my pet portraits. My blog, if you just want to go straight for it without looking at the website, is Unwritten Grace Writing. That's unwrittengrace.wordpress.com. My book, Approaching Autistic Adulthood, The Road Less Travelled, can be found on Amazon. Also, for any UK listeners, via any UK bookshop, you can order it in. I've seen it in a local bookshop before, which was a really surreal experience, to be honest, but really exciting.
So cool.
Yeah. Just seeing it casually sitting there on the shelf.
Yeah, and I'll put those links in the show notes so people can find you that way as well, to your websites.
Yeah, and my pet portraits can be found on my website. I also have them on Instagram and on Facebook. It's just Grace Liu Pet Portraits. I don't know if there's a way to screen share so I can show recent examples, or would that not be appropriate for this?
I don't know. Yeah, actually, I've never done that. We can try that. Let me see.
Yep. So these are my pet portraits on Facebook. I'll just click on some of the stronger ones, I think. But yeah, there's this one here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I draw these. I've got a set of 72 colour pencils that my mum very kindly got me for Christmas a few years ago. There's this one.
Wow. So do you do these from photographs?
Yeah, so people send me photos, and yeah, I draw them. I ask people what size they want, and also whether they want a full background, a single colour background, or a plain background, because those things will all affect the price. And yeah, I draw it and then post it when it's ready. And as you can see, I share online, but obviously if people don't want me to do that, then I won't do that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, these are really cool. Oh, wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love this. And it's colored pencil that you use.
Yeah, color pencil. Yeah, I start with just plain pencil outline, then I go over it in pen, and then when the pen's dried, I go over and color it in with color pencils.
Very nice. Oh yeah, this is great. Yeah, I know people love their pets, and I'm sure there are so many people who just would love to get like a nice portrait like this of their cat or their dog or their other pet.
Yeah, and I offer free shipping if it's in the UK, but I do ask that people cover the costs if it's going outside the UK, if that makes sense.
I see. Okay, so then basically they're getting the actual pencil drawing and online share of it as well if they want it. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, very cool. Yeah, Grace, thank you so much for sharing so much of your experience and all of the great work that you're doing. Is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know, or anything that they can help or support you with?
I think more generally, I always say to people, promote what autistic people are saying about their experiences, listen to autistic voices. The same goes for other minority categories as well. So LGBT people and people in racial minorities. It's not woke, it's not political. These things are important, and they're people's realities, so we really need to be listening and understanding. I think with me specifically, yeah, definitely have a read of my book, my blog. I'd be very happy to get in touch, answer any questions. Yeah, I think that's basically it, really.
All right, fabulous. Yeah. Well, Grace, thank you. It's been great talking with you, and thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.